So welcome, everyone. I'm Kristen Eshelman. I'm Vice President for Library and Information Technology at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. We are so glad you are able to join us for our 10th and final conversation in this series on academic innovation and the public good. These are ongoing dialogues about the future of higher education and how to change it for the better. Stanford and Trinity College co-organized this series along with 18 co-sponsors in higher ed. Each event features a prominent author or authors, in this case, in conversation with an expert colleague. Directly following tonight's author conversation, we hope you will join us for a very special 30-minute author after party celebrating the conclusion of the Academic Innovation for the Public Good Conversation series. Hear thoughts from a group of 5 leading authors as they discuss themes from this year's program, including how to make higher education's future more equitable and accessible. Audience members will have the opportunity to meet one another and provide feedback on next year's program. We'll put that registration link in the Zoom chat now. Please do consider joining us after today's session. For those who want to buy a copy of tonight's book, please visit the website of independent bookseller Book Culture. We will put that link in the chat now. A limited number of signed copies will be available for tonight's book. And with that, I am pleased to introduce our 2 co-authors, Tia Brown McNair, Vice President in the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Student Success, and Executive Director for the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Campus Centers at the AAC&U, American Association of Colleges and Universities, and Lindsey Malcom-Piqueux, Assistant Vice President, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Assessment, Chief Diversity Officer, and Chief Institutional Research Officer at Caltech. Their esteemed co-author, Estela Mara Bensimon, University Professor Emerita at the University of Southern California and founder of the Center for Urban Education at U.S.A, unfortunately could not be with us today due to some personal circumstances. Their book, From Equity Talk to Equity Walk, Expanding Practitioner Knowledge for Racial Justice in Higher Education, delves into design and application of campus change strategies for achieving equitable outcomes and provides guidance on building an equity-minded campus culture, aligning strategic priorities and institutional missions to advance equity and much more. They will be interviewed tonight by Anita Davis, Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Trinity College. Thank you, Tia, Lindsey, and Anita for joining us tonight. We are incredibly grateful to you for being part of this series. Before I turn the floor over to Anita, I want to briefly outline the format of tonight's program. This conversation is part of an ongoing dialogue. As such, we will be leaving the Zoom chat room open, and we invite you to engage there. We will monitor the Zoom chat for instances of inappropriate or disruptive language, and if necessary, we will remove users from the event. Following the conclusion of tonight's author conversation, we will open the floor to audience questions. If you would like to submit a question at any time during the event, please use the Zoom Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Again, thank you so much for joining us. I will hand it over to Anita. Take it away.
Thank you, Kristen. I appreciate that introduction. And we are all here tonight to talk about such a very thought-provoking book. I want to say that I'm honored to have the chance to moderate this conversation. I'll just say that we hoped it really is a conversation. I mean, I think it's sort of like we're chatting because we're old friends. We're not really old friends, but we're chatting because we're going to be old friends by the time we finish the conversation. For those of you in the audience, about 30 minutes of this conversation will just be the 3 of us. And then we'll take your questions. But I want to encourage you as we're going along, if questions come to mind, put them in the Q&A. So we will be looking at those questions. So don't hesitate. Don't feel that you need to wait until our conversation is over to start putting questions in the Q&A. So having said that, my hardest task tonight will be to make sure that I stick to 30 minutes. Reading the book was one of the things that in terms of thinking about my work as a VP for DEI, so thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion in the landscape, it made me question our practice here at Trinity. I imagine that it's brought up ideas and ways that we can do better. And so I just want to first say thank you for giving us this gift. It really is a gift, especially for practitioners. So I'm curious, and I imagine that some in the audience are also curious to hear about, how did the book come about? What was the motivation? What made you say, we need to do this?
So Lindsey, you want me to take that? You want me to take
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah.
Great, thanks. So thank you so much for having us and having us as part of this conversation. And I first want to say, anytime that I'm in space with Lindsey and have the opportunity to be with her, and I wish Estela was able to be with us, but we're sending her all of our positive energy and vibe, because I just want to acknowledge the fact that she is Estela Bensimon, right? Someone who has been a mentor and a guide to so many of us. And anytime I get the opportunity to say that, I want to make sure that we recognize that without her, this book would not have happened. Lindsey and I have been honored and privileged to learn from her. So Estela, I don't know if you're listening in or not right now, but we want to tell you, thank you so much for letting us learn from you and give your gift and knowledge to so many of us within the community. So I want to start off with saying that. So how did we do this book? Well, first, let's say we were in a project. It was AAC&U Centennial. And we started working on a project called Committing to Equity and Inclusive Excellence, Campus-Based Strategies for Student Success, which the first chapter talks about. It lays that foundation. And we were doing the traditional things, disaggregating data on student participation, high impact practices, looking at course retention, graduation rates, trying to get the teams that came to us as part of our Equity Academy to delve deeper into the questions of equity and student success and institutional change and transformation. And as we were going through this process, they were disaggregating data, we were having those conversations, but the deeper conversations about racial inequities and being more race conscious and really trying to understand racialized practices within the institutions, that was a little bit more of a struggle. And we had that conversation as a team. And again, honored that Lindsey and Estela joined me on that effort for this particular project. But I want to be honest with you, and Estela, if she was here, she would tell you the same thing, that when we said we wanted to do this, when I brought this idea to Lindsey and Estela, Lindsey, you said yes. Estela was like, no, I don't have time. No. And she would tell you that. She would honestly tell you that. And I think I'm hoping that our collaboration is, because obviously she eventually said yes, and our collaboration and really focus on a practice-oriented book, has been so well received within the community and from our colleagues, and really trying to delve into the deeper questions about equity. So that's how it happened. It wasn't, oh yes, all at the very beginning. It was, okay, how do we do this? What do we need to do in order to make this happen? And so I'm glad that both of them eventually said yes.
Thank you, Tia. Lindsey, if you want to add anything, feel free to, or we can keep going.
Well, I think what I would add is that our vision for the book really emerged from Tia and Estela's thinking. And I will have to say that it evolved over time. I think we were trying to be responsive to what we saw the teams from the Equity Academy as needing in order to actually have an impact in closing racial equity gaps on their campuses. And so we really approached the book with that practitioner orientation. We wanted it to be kind of a practical guide for those who understood the importance of trying to achieve equity, but just simply may not know where to start, or may not understand the importance of kind of keeping that historical context in mind when we think about how do we frame issues related to equity and inequity, inclusion and exclusion, and how we can actually have a positive impact at each of our institutional campuses. So I would really have to say that the teams themselves and the challenges that they face as groups, and our work in trying to kind of support them as they navigated through the project and through their work, also served as inspiration for the book, because we wanted it to be useful to them and to practitioners across the country who are very much like them.
Yeah, thank you. You were talking about sort of this, in my mind, when I hear you say that, frequently throughout the book, you all talk about meeting people where they are on their journey. And one of the early parts of the book where you begin to talk about this issue of equity, right? Equity is complicated. Like, equity is complicated. It seems like a word that is in the water now. It's in the air. It's everywhere. And I found that people actually are sometimes using equality when they mean equity and vice versa. So I'm wondering, in terms of the historical progression, because I believe there's been a progression from equality, maybe to equity, maybe there's an intersection. Could y'all talk a little bit about how you've helped institutions, campuses, teams think about those two constructs separately, and whether or not there's room for both?
I can jump in to start off with, Tia. I think oftentimes when we think of the whole equality versus equity, kind of conversation and those two terms and how they relate to one another, some people may visualize, the diagram with the boxes and the baseball game, or the apple tree and trying to pick apples from the tree. But I think one of the things that we really emphasize when trying to help, individuals understand the difference between these terms is equity is rooted within justice. It is, acknowledging and aware of and responsive to the fact that there is a social and historical context in which the racial inequities that we see that have persisted across years and years and years, how they were created. They were created by design. They weren't, as Estela always says, they're not some natural disaster that just happened and it befell our nation and it's so awful and, what can we do? Let's clutch our pearls. It needs to, equity kind of focuses on justice because it is about righting that injustice, that historical injustice, and unfortunately the ongoing forms of injustice that many individuals from racially minoritized communities continue to experience. And so while equity relates to fairness and justice, equality is about sameness. But we understand that, in terms of meeting the practitioners where they are, we also need to think about, communities and students and where they are and from which they come, and recognizing that the circumstances in which they receive their primary and secondary education, what kind of access that they had to various kind of enrichment opportunities to, prepare for higher education, all of that was informed by and structured by kind of the socio-historical context in which we all find ourselves. And so there's that critical element to equity that necessitates that we be attentive to that. And it also necessitates understanding that the inequities that exist, although there are inequities that exist among many dimensions of social identity for various reasons, the root causes are different. And because of that, oftentimes the approaches in order to redress them need to be different as well.
Yeah, definitely, Lindsey. I think, you just captured the crux of what we did in the book and in the conversations that we've had and continue to have. And it's not just Anita talking about equity and equality. I say it all the time that we have to understand a lot of the different terms: justice, inclusive excellence, anti-racism, whiteness. Just across the equity consciousness, equity mindedness. There's a lot of, we throw around a lot of words within higher education, and we throw around a lot of terminology that many of us are not embracing and translating into practice. And what we have to do is have a deeper understanding, not just of equality and equity, but what all of those terms mean within our work, because they're not the same. And we have to decide, okay, what perspective, which lens are we going to be examining our policies and our practices and our structures through, and how are we going to be making decisions, and how are we going to use this to build our own knowledge base and sense making for really investigating and interrogating our data and thinking about student success, thinking about the success of educators on our campus. All of these pieces are critically important for us as we're thinking about terminology and language across the board.
Yeah, thank you for that. As you were talking, you all do a really good job, I think, of so many things. And so it's very hard to figure out which part of that terminology, but the equity mindedness construct, right, versus the deficit minded construct, like that is something that's really, you do a lot of work to help people understand that the questions, right, the questions that get asked and the language that we use are really significant. And so I was wondering if you might talk, because all institutions, I believe, all institutions have aspirations to not have a deficit perspective, right? We hear that a lot. We're not going to have that, but I'm not quite sure that that is connected to the actual questions and the goals that institutions have. So could you talk a little bit about this equity-mindedness perspective versus this deficit-minded perspective?
Yeah. Do you want me to start, Lindsey, or do you want?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, no, again. So I mean, one of the things that we are always and constantly thinking about is making sure that people have a clear understanding of equity mindedness and the term. When it was coined by Estela and her colleagues at the Center for Urban Education, I mean, being true to the fact that it is about being race conscious and systemically and historically and culturally aware of the constructs that have an influence on the way that our environments are designed, and not putting the blame on students themselves to make those changes, right? It's a responsibility of us to understand the concept of what it means to be race conscious and looking through the work through a racial equity lens. And I think for many of us, we try to equate that with, looking at the equity in student outcomes, which is important, but it's not the same thing. Being race conscious about why those inequities in student outcomes exist is more along the lines of what it means to be equity minded. And we want to go deeper into that conversation and really try to examine those racialized practices that are happening within the classroom, within co-curricular activities, within institution structures, to try to figure out, okay, why are these happening? What do we need to do to change to make sure that this environment is equitable for our students? So that's that particular part. And when we talk about being deficit minded, we want to make sure we're not putting the blame on the students. We're not saying to them that it is only their responsibility and because of them and what they have done, this is why they're engaging in this environment or experiencing it in that particular way. One of the things that we say in the book that is so very true, and I say it all the time in lots of presentations, that when we see equity gaps, we see them because what we have designed isn't working as intended. And it is our responsibility to reimagine and remake those educational designs to support our students and their success. Lindsey, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Tia. What you said really kind of hits home on what I think about too when I kind of think about these two concepts, being deficit-minded versus equity-minded. And kind of one of the shorthand ways that I have for remembering it is, where does the origin for inequities that we observe, where does it lie? If we're deficit-minded, oftentimes what we're doing is we're attributing those to dysfunctions in students, deficits in students, or in their communities, or in their culture. That kind of deficit-minded perspective is not attentive to the fact, again, what we're talking about, kind of the systemic barriers that exist and that were erected purposefully in many cases. And equity mindedness, on the other hand, places or locates kind of the origin of inequities in dysfunctional practices. As Tia said, the practices are not working as intended. And so one of the things that Estela has said over and over again that just kind of sticks with me, because the way that turn a phrase, it was just, really, really kind of impactful on me, is instead of talking about remediating students, let's talk about remediating practices. Mm-hmm. So, it really is a different way of thinking. And the reason why it's so important is because the solutions, or the kinds of questions that one asks ourselves about, well, what's leading to these outcomes? The range of them is very different based on if you're taking a deficit-minded perspective or an equity-minded perspective. If you're taking a deficit-minded perspective, you may think, well, our students just aren't resilient, or they're not prepared, or, the very kind of stereotypical thinking, racial trope about, well, they just don't value education. All of these really horribly racist beliefs. But when you kind of locate the cause of inequity within students themselves, within their communities, within their families, within their culture, it limits your thinking. Whereas if you're equity minded and you say, okay, well, no, the inequities that we observe result from practices that aren't working as intended, as Tia so, eloquently summarized it, then look, the questions that you're asking are all about things that you can control. You can change your practices. You can innovate and experiment in order to see how can we ensure that students have equitable opportunity to learn, to engage, to have equitable experiences at our institution, which then will result in equitable outcomes. And so, the kind of orientation or even just range of options is very different depending on what frame of mind you are, looking at those disaggregated data with. It really does shape the kind of questions that you're asking yourself and your colleagues. And one leads to a path of really not, action that I think is limited in nature. If there's really anything to be done at all, oftentimes it ends up in kind of finger pointing. And as I said, really kind of rooted in stereotypical thinking, whereas an equity-minded perspective is, it kind of points you to actions that can be taken. It points you to, further inquiry and examination or critical examination of your own practices that you can do in order to try to close those equity gaps that you observe in your data.
Lindsey, that's so true. I was just thinking, there was an article that Yolanda Watson-Spiva and Estela co-authored just recently in Diverse Issues in Higher Education, where they were talking about we need to stop thinking about student equity gaps and we need to start looking and examining institutional equity gaps. Mm-hmm. When I was hearing you thinking, that's all I kept thinking, yes, let's look at the institutional equity gaps, not just where our students are experiencing inequities and outcomes, which is important, don't get me wrong, but looking at it from the perspective of institutional equity gaps reframes the whole conversation. Thank you. And Matt already put it on. There it is. I mean, you're great, Matthew. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And I see that some folks are already adding questions to the Q&A, so please continue to do that. We appreciate that. Listening to both of you, so I'm working on moderating my enthusiasm so I can try to get through more questions. But one of the, as you were talking, two separate trains of thought happened. One, Tia, when you were talking about institutional equity gaps, it really made me think about in the latter chapter of the book, educating first generation equity practitioners. I think that construct is just really powerful. And so it's not at the institutional level, but I thought it might be nice to hear why you all think that that's such a powerful framing, because we have language at our institutions, right, about first gen students or at-risk students, or there's just lots of words like that are quite deficit leaning, right? But the impact for those students, if you carry that through, Lindsey, as you were saying, is a very different path. However, for these first generation equity practitioners, it's a really powerful segment of the book about what that means for them. So maybe talk a little bit about that construct for folks to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, I can jump in. So I am a former faculty member. And although I had the great privilege of studying and having Estela as my graduate advisor, my prior training was in STEM. And, I was on the path of kind of becoming a faculty member within a STEM field before I kind of switched fields. And I have to tell you that when we were kind of being socialized into the discipline, serving as TAs, trying to kind of engage in all of those experiences that were intended to prepare us to be faculty. Never once, not a single time, were we told to think about equity or how to create equity. That was not kind of the yardstick or a metric by which, you know, any kind of conversations about what we're expected to produce or create or bring in, if we're talking about grant dollars as a faculty member at a research institution, which is the path that I was on, equity was never mentioned. And so we have an entire generation of higher education practitioners for whom many of which probably equity was never centered as this is a metric of your effectiveness and performance, whether that be at the individual level or at the institutional level. And so we have this whole generation of this workforce of higher ed practitioners who are learning for the first time as they are in the midst of being practitioners and working with students and working with each other in order to, you know, create this higher education experience for students at our institutions who aren't really prepared to do so. They haven't been challenged to do so prior to, you know, in recent years where equity has started to be injected into more of the discourse. It's starting to become more talked about in terms of accountability schemes or, you know, metrics of success, et cetera. And so there is this process where there's unlearning that many folks have to do because, you know, at least in STEM, we really kind of push that whole false meritocracy, you know, narrative and myth. And, you know, oftentimes we, as the socialization is happening, we're kind of learning all of these tropes about, well, what does a scientist look like? And, you know, and so unfortunately, all of those things, even if it's unintentional, they end up affecting our practice. And so for me, the first generation equity practitioner really underscores the fact that just like with first gen students who may not have had a model within their family to look towards for, you know, having had that same type of higher education experience, there are practitioners who may not have had a prior model to look towards to see, how do I engage in equity-minded practice? How do I create an inclusive and equitable classroom? How can I kind of reframe how I think about my own effectiveness as an instructor, not just by looking at, you know, those very flawed teaching evaluations, or, you know, how many of my advisees go on to, you know, get jobs in this industry or graduate school or whatever the case may be, but how well am I doing at producing equity and kind of living up to that? You know, oftentimes I would say all of our institutions probably state that as an institutional value, but living up to it is an entirely kind of different ball of wax. And so we have folks who are kind of doing it for the first time. And so it really is this kind of developmental journey that involves unlearning and relearning and asking ourselves really difficult questions about, well, why are we continuing to do things the way that they've always been done? Particularly if the way that they've always been done is rooted in institutional racism, for example. So thinking about things like using the GREs for admission to graduate school, or, you know, other standardized tests for admissions to you know, undergraduate programs, those kinds of practices, if you look at the history for why they were created, it is rooted in institutional racism. They were a means to kind of keep out, exclude certain populations. And so a willingness to kind of understand that context, to ask yourselves the difficult questions, to unlearn what may have worked for you because you were able to navigate that system, but may not work for our students because it's not equitable. I think that is all part of the challenge of being a first generation equity practitioner.
Yes, and there's a lot at stake if we only stay as first generation equity practitioners. And I think that is coming through very clear in the book and as the way we talk about it, that we can't sit within that for our institutions, for ourselves as educators, and most importantly for our students. And our job is that if you are and you identify as a first generation equity practitioner, we have a responsibility to become more seasoned and to grow and to develop into more seasoned equity practitioners, because there's too much at stake. And when James Gray and Estela coined that term and started using that terminology of first generation equity practitioner, it was a challenge, but it was also an observation that many of us sit within that space, and we just can't do that anymore.
Yeah, thank you both for that. So this next question, I think it's one of the hardest questions. There are a lot of hard questions in the book. So if you don't have the book, I want to just say there are incredible questions that will challenge you to really sit and think about what it is that you're trying to do, how you're approaching it, and the path that you're on, and an assessment of where you are personally and also as the institution you may belong to. But you all talk specifically about the whiteness question, and I want to read this. The whiteness question you all frame as, in what ways does whiteness operate in our practices and policies, and what is the price it imposes on racially minoritized students? So you talked a little bit about that in responding to the first generation equity practitioner question. I'm particularly curious about, has asking that questions, requiring institutions to ask that questions, individuals, has that changed over time? We're in a chilly, hostile moment, some would say, when we talk about issues of race and racism. And I'm wondering, in your work, has this season in our nation made that harder or not, or changed it in ways of responding, of getting folks to really reflect on and respond to that question?
So I'm going to say the answer is yes. The environment right now makes the conversation to talk about whiteness and the normalization of whiteness within our institutions, within the way we do things, within our routine practices. So yes, but should we stop talking about it? And the answer to that obviously is no. We need to continue to have those conversations and give people concrete examples of how it manifests within our institutional structures, within our policies, within our system. I use the example of the equity gaps all the time. It is steeped in institutional racism, the way we even privilege the performance of one group as our default for success, and say that this is where our aspirational goal is to get everyone where, whoever that majority group is, what for retention, graduation. It limits us if we only say that we're closing the equity gap to get everyone up to that level. We have to think in a bigger picture. And oftentimes in our work, when we're talking about data and data analysis, or we're talking about looking at equity gaps, most institutions are continuously looking at the way that they do that from a very normalized perspective of privilege and bias within just saying that one group's performance is the aspirational goal for everyone. Yes, we want to close the equity gaps, and that represents an equity gap. And Lindsey did a great job of talking about that in the book. But if we only stop there, then we are limiting our ability of understanding how racialized practices are inherent within the way that we do things. And that's just one example of how I always try to think of it, to give people an example that we're not trying to say that whiteness is something that, oh, it's us against them. No, it's just the reality that our institutions were never designed to serve those racially minoritized, to serve us as racially minoritized people. So Lindsey, I don't know if you I know you have other things to say about this. So.
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo, I think what Tia said, really about how we're even framing, when we do the disaggregation of data, how we normalize a specific group. Oftentimes we are normalizing white students. That is, by very definition, that is what whiteness is. And so, yes, that is very problematic. I would say that in this particular moment, it is very, very difficult to talk about this. And I think, because if you look in that book, kind of ways like in the chapter that was talking about data, there were kind of common like deflection strategies that individuals use. If we could do an updated and revised expanded version of the book, I would need to add so many different things to that list, because everything is so politicized now. And you know, even kind of thinking and caring about equity and racial equity specifically is enough to kind of then open discussions about, you know, being woke or not being woke. One of the things my mother always says that I love is like, of course I want to be woke. You know, the opposite of being woke is being asleep, right? But I mean,
yes, Shirley.
But I mean that kind of it's almost kind of there are these kind of ideological. The discourse is so polarized. Everything is kind of looked at through the lens of ideology now, even more so than when the book was written. I mean, I thought at the time of its publishing that it couldn't get worse, but in fact it has, when there is legislation and certain contexts in which higher education institutions are operating. There are these kind of external pressures, political pressures about what you can and cannot teach. And if you talk about certain topics, then, you know, you may open yourself up to scrutiny or to allegations or to lawsuits or to worse. And here we are saying, no, you need to focus on racial equity. You need to be positively racially conscious. And that is really kind of runs counter to, I think, some of the pressures that are kind of present in the current context. So it is really difficult work, but I think we have to try to strip away ideology from it to the extent possible. Yes. And, you know, not to kind of jump ahead, Anita, but I think one of the ways to do that is to think about it in terms of, you know, the public good. That has never been kind of disputed, at least, you know, in word, I should say. Indeed, maybe sometimes it didn't always happen, but, you know, the connection between higher education and advancing the public good. And so linking equity and racial equity to that, maybe, you know, a way that we can try to kind of get out of, or perhaps navigate this just very kind of treacherous political context in which we find ourselves right now. But, you know, it is difficult. It's made more difficult, but we have to continue to you know, forge ahead.
Yeah, you know, I was talking to a group this morning and having this conversation about our messaging has to be so different to reach a broader audience within this and get out of this us and them and this combative nature that we have when it comes to even talking about equity and racial equity and having these deeper discussions. I just was just really trying to hone in on the fact that there's enough. We don't, just because I want something, or I want to focus on equities and I want to have these deeper conversations, doesn't mean that I'm taking anything away from you or your family or your work. It is about us thinking about the public good of why it's necessary for us to think about what's going to benefit all of us, what's going to benefit our community, what is really going to be justice centered, so that we can take corrective action to support everyone. And I wish that we would get off of this, you know, combative piece of that. If we're talking about equity, then that means that someone's going to lose out. It's never been about that. It has never been about that. And I wish people would understand that.
Thank you both for that. And obviously I knew the answer to that question was yes, but you all told me yes and how, right? So I think it's really important and significant. Thank you. And for that framing, there is this sentiment that there has to be winners and losers right now in a way that I don't think it has always been there. So I appreciate that, and thinking and helping us to think about a different way as we approach the work. So I am going to transition us now to our audience questions. We have quite a few. And so to get through them, maybe Tia or Lindsey, one of you might want to take one and then we'll go to the next. You all can kind of decide because we'll try to get through as many of those as we can. The first one is, what's the potential for higher ed institutions to influence or improve funding for historically and currently underfunded public school systems? Can advocating for better funding and better resource school systems be part of the strategy? So I'm not sure.
I have an idea for this. This is one of those things where I think, you know what, the way that it's done and how it's based on, you know, communities and tax dollars and everything like that, I'm one of those people who are saying, you know what, let's just totally dismantle that. Let's just totally dismantle that and take the tax dollars. And in this case, I do believe in equality in distribution of resources. And I think that it's so important for us to think that this, for really us to think critically about how the current system, about where you live and the tax dollars and how it's based, especially for K through 12, needs to be redistributed and reimagined. That's just one of my personal, I'm not speaking on behalf of an advocate for ACNU, I'm speaking on behalf of Tia McNair right now. I think that from a K through 12 system needs to be reimagined. And for higher ed, I just, in my mind, if we think about higher education for the public good, well, how can it be something that serves the public good and we underfund it on a consistent basis, and we underfund and take more and more tax dollars, which raises the tuition costs for our students, which puts us into the situation where more and more students are taking out loans, which obviously influences, I mean, it's just a ripple effect, and it keeps going and going and going and going. So I do think that one of the things that if we're going to be true, for, I mean, not just talk about equity, but put it into practice, that the reimagining of the public funding for our K through 12 and for higher education, I think it needs to be totally reimagined.
And I'm sorry to break the rules. I just have to very quickly say this because one of the
please go ahead.
We just started. It's a yes and the and is the fact that higher education institutions play a huge role in public education because we prepare teachers. And so reimagining how we think about teacher preparation and how we talk about and conceptualize and frame and center equity in that, I think, is also another way to have an incredible impact. So yes, and. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you. You absolutely can break the rules. They're not really rules, but and I like the and. So there's a question about whether or not you might be able to share one or two examples of equity practitioners' discovery of inequitable practices and how those practitioners remediated those practices.
I can start off with one. Actually just recently, I worked with Estela on a project. It was using many of the same kind of frameworks and approaches that were outlined in the book. And it was about, math education specifically. And there were community college faculty members who participated in an institute over the course of some months where they were learning about equity in the context of math education at the developmental and college level. And as a part of that work, one of the things that I did was to look at the course syllabi from the faculty members, the participants, kind of submitted before they did the course, the month-long kind of engagement workshop, the institute, and then after. And I did a comparison and analysis of how those things change. And one of the ways that many of the course syllabi changed was the way that the faculty members stopped kind of assuming what students would come in knowing about how college, how higher education, how it works. How do you navigate? What are office hours for? There's so many things that I think kind of shorthand that we often use in our instruction, whether that be in the classroom or our kind of instructional artifacts, as faculty members, where we are assuming, I think implicitly what is assumed is that everyone is like us, everyone has had our own experience. They kind of come in knowing with this baseline level of knowledge. And so that process of kind of unlearning that and being intentional in how we demystify certain practices and processes within higher ed that are often taken for granted, that our first generation students may not, have had the exposure to by the very nature of being first gen students. Just kind of taking that assumption out and laying out very clearly kind of the terms of success. What do you need to do to succeed in my class? In addition to that, thinking about issues of representation and how can I highlight, the contributions of individuals with minoritized backgrounds who, have made wonderful contributions within mathematics. How can I bring that and highlight that in my course? So that kind of intentionality in looking at your course syllabus, your assessments, your lecture notes, everything that you do as potential vehicles to bring about equity is something that a first generation equity practitioner does. And so that willingness to kind of look at what they've always done with new eyes, as in an effort to make it more equitable and make it more accessible and make it more inclusive, is one really clear example that I got to see firsthand just very recently when Estela and I did that work together.
Yeah, and when you just said that, I was thinking to myself, I don't know if I can pull out just one, because that's what I do on a day-to-day basis, whether it's talking about how high impact practices are designed, whether it's doing the work on truth, racial healing, and transformation, and working with institutions on examining their institutional narratives through their artifacts and their documents and the way that they are engaging with their community. All of that is part are clear examples on how we are thinking about being more equity minded and focused on the work that we need to do as practitioners to really think about institutional transformation in a way that is beyond just the scope of looking at metrics on student success. It's really thinking about the holistic view of what needs to change at the institution, from leadership, from equity and leadership, and equity also in diversity and representation, but also just what does it mean what's the process that we're utilizing to really examine racialized practices within our institutions. And I think those are some of the things that we work on and that all of us are focused on in our work. And so I don't know if there are multiple. I'm so glad that, Lindsey, you talked about the syllabus and different things, but we're talking about it within teaching and learning and assessments as well too. How do we do this work that's going to support what it means to be an equity-minded practitioner?
So this next question, I think, Tia, you're talking about, it's really about institutional transformation. And we've been talking a lot about students and student success. This next question is about researchers and professors. So this question is, in terms of diversifying researchers and professors, what practical steps can institutions take to support, for instance, professors and graduate students who are caring for young children or for older relatives? It's my impression that women are more likely to have research and work disrupted or interrupted because of caregiving responsibilities.
So the answer to that is yes. That is exactly what happens. Lindsey, right? That's exactly what happens within the system, is that burden tends to fall on women, and in particular women of color, as we especially dealing with the multiple perspectives of providing that support for our families, but also providing that support for those who are within our communities and within the higher education institutions that are experiencing these obstacles and barriers to their success. We tend to be that support network for each other, and we don't shy away from that. And that's part of it. So the answer to that is yes, that does happen. And we honestly need to think about ways where we are making sure that that burden isn't carried by the same group of people, the same group of educators that is unfair and that hinders their development and that hinders their ability to be promoted. and thinking about that. And institutions are doing a better job. There's some examples where institutions are doing a better job of providing those additional resources and those additional support, but we have to make sure that it's not seen as something that is, oh, well, you had this extra support, you had this extra work, when these programs are designed to support success. And Lindsey, I don't know if you want to add to that, but what I've heard from many of my colleagues is that, you know what, that's true, and we haven't fixed it yet, and we need to fix it.
Yeah, one of the other things that I would just add is institutions, I think, need to also be open to critical self-reflection on their own processes, not just for the ways that they're, interacting with teaching students, but also, hiring, promotion, tenure, that critical self-reflection and the willingness to identify where are the equity threats in our process. Where are there ways, where are there locations where our incentives are not aligned with what our stated values are? And how can we place kind of checks in the process in order to interrupt the usual, kind of interrupt like the inertia of always doing things the way that they've been done, continuing that process. And so that means, if we need to be willing to look at things like incentive structures, and if we, kind of say that we value mentoring, but all of the research tells us that, the responsibility for mentoring, particularly, students with gender expansive identities or racially minoritized identities, tends to fall on the few faculty who also share those identities with them, then, we need to consider realigning our incentive structure in order to reward that kind of work. And so there's this kind of implicit hierarchy in the type of work that faculty members and researchers, professors are doing, the nature of their work, no matter if we're talking about a community college context or, a research university context. And so ensuring that having a willingness to kind of look at and problematize the way that things have always been done, because the way that things have always been done are what have led us to this point. And so if we are not happy with, the kind of degree of diversity that we have within our faculty ranks or within our administrator ranks or staff ranks at our institutions, then, that willingness to kind of take a hard look in the mirror and, be willing to change some things or be willing to, pilot or innovate, even if you don't want to change everything at the institution, all at once. Why don't we try and kind of see, what happens? Of course, informed by research and, being ensuring that we're doing it in a way that is responsible. We're thinking about assessment, all of those kinds of things. But I think there really needs to be a willingness to kind of take a hard look and critical examination to identify how, practices as they've always been, just are rife with threats to equity.
Exactly. And if you're going to put the burden, if that burden continues to be on a certain group of faculty, then don't devalue that work in the tenure and promotion process. Don't devalue it when you're thinking about it. If they're carrying the burden and you know that it's reality and we know what's happening, don't devalue that as less than in the tenure and promotion process.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. This will be our last question. I'm trying to be mindful of time. And so this one came in very early during our conversation. So, and I think it's really, really one that I know this person would love to hear your thoughts about, as with all of them. This one in particular is about, what advice would you give to recent PhDs who want to switch gears and move into this equity space in higher education?
Lindsey, I'll let you go.
Sure. As someone who did that, I would have to, I would have to say you first need to understand kind of what is motivating your desire to make that switch. And then looking for ways that you can get involved maybe in your kind of current context. If you are a current PhD and or a recent PhD and you are, I don't know, in a postdoctoral appointment or something of that nature, or teaching position at a community college, and you want to transition to equity work, look for opportunities to try to advance equity in the space where you're located now. So if you are working in a lab, for example, and I'm sorry, I keep kind of coming back to these STEM examples, it's a function of who I am and where I work. But, thinking about how can we create and foster an inclusive culture, an equitable culture within our own group, or, within my own classroom, how can I think about and advance equity through the practices in which I engage, how I interact with my students, or how I identify who's going to serve as my TAs, if you have the opportunity to do that. I would say learn by doing, and make sure that you are staying up to date with individuals who are leaders in the space. Tia is one of them. Estela Bensimon, of course, is another one of them. But there are so many different kind of institutes and professional development opportunities that exist. Many of them are disciplinary specific. Some of them are kind of cut across higher ed more broadly. But there are so many kind of learning opportunities that are out there. Many of them are even more accessible now because they're being held virtually, as we are right now, given kind of the changing world as we are emerging from the pandemic. And so seize those opportunities and really try to engage. And every single space can be made more equitable. And so I would say look for a way to have an impact, taking kind of research informed and data driven approaches in your own current context.
And just do it. We need more within all disciplines across. And sometimes people who are doing the work, who are steeped in the discipline, are the ones that can actually make the most difference. So yes, and Lindsey, you're one of those leaders too, and I'm just always honored to be in space with you. I just want to tell you, thank you.
Lindsey and Tia, this has been my honor and privilege to be a part of the conversation tonight. Thank you both so much, and Estela, for the book. We appreciate it. I definitely encourage you to get it if you haven't gotten it. There are wonderful case studies and examples. There's lots of strategies that are practitioner oriented. So I encourage you to think about purchasing it. And thank you all for gifting it to us. And Kristen, I will turn things back over to you to close us out.
Thank you,
Anita.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to echo Anita's thanks to you, Anita, and also to you, Tia and Lindsey. It was such a generative discussion. You can tell from the number of questions and the conversation that was going on in the chat. There are a lot of things swirling in our heads right now. And so if you want to continue that conversation, please visit our website. We invite you to come and tell us how elements of your own institutional context may have shaped your ability to engage in a positive race-conscious equity work on your campus. So please join us. You can find the URL in the chat. Lindsey will be looking to respond to any comments you might post there in the next 24 hours. Thank you, Lindsey, for that. Let's really keep this important conversation going. For me, as someone who is leading DEI efforts for my division, I'm so thankful to be able to work with Anita on this, but having a guide, a practitioner's guide like this, is such a valuable resource. So I want to thank you for that. And it was a really great conversation. So again, for those of you who are interested in purchasing a copy of From Equity Talk to Equity Walk, please visit the website of independent bookseller Book Culture. We will put that link in the chat again. And just a reminder that a limited number of signed copies will be available. So jump on that. Please also complete our user survey and let us know what you thought of this year's book series and what you would like to see perhaps in next year's program. We'll also put that link in the chat. Thank you, David. And finally, we hope you will all join us for a very special author after party coming up next, where we will celebrate the conclusion of this academic innovation for the public good book conversation series this year, which will start in just a few minutes. And we will put that registration link in the Zoom chat now. Thank you all for attending, and we hope you have a great night.